People don't transform their lives because they suddenly become stronger, smarter, or more disciplined. They transform when something inside them quietly shifts, when one decision changes the direction of everything that follows. And here's the interesting part. Most people think life changes in big moments, a breakthrough job, a perfect opportunity, a lucky break. But the truth is far more uncomfortable and far more powerful. Life changes the moment you decide that your current story is no longer acceptable. Not tomorrow, not when things get easier, not when motivation shows up. Right now. Because every single person listening to this is already living inside a set of decisions they made yesterday and last month and last year. And if you want a different life, you don't start with more time. You don't start with more resources. You start with one decision. I will no longer tolerate staying the same. And once that decision is made, really made, everything else begins to reorganize itself around it. Your habits, your focus, your standards, even the people around you. So the real question is not, how do I transform my life? The real question is, what is the one decision you are still avoiding that would change everything if you finally made it? One decision can redefine the entire direction of your life, but most people misunderstand what that really means. They imagine a dramatic moment, a sudden leap, or a clear sign from life that tells them, this is it. But in reality, the most powerful decisions are rarely loud. They are quiet, almost invisible at first. They happen in the mind long before they ever show up in action. And yet, those quiet moments become the turning points that separate a life of repetition from a life of transformation. Because every person is already living inside the consequences of earlier decisions. Some made consciously, some made out of fear, some made simply by avoiding a choice altogether. And what we often call life circumstances are really just the echo of decisions that were made in silence. When you begin to understand this, something shifts. You stop seeing life as something happening to you, and you start seeing it as something that has been shaped by what you have allowed, accepted, and chosen to continue. One decision can redefine everything because a decision is not just an action, it is a declaration. It is a statement about identity. The moment you decide, truly decide, that you will no longer accept a certain standard in your life, you are not just changing behavior, you are changing the internal agreement you have with yourself. And that internal agreement is what everything else is built on. People think they struggle with habits, but the deeper truth is they struggle with commitment to identity. Because habits will always follow what you believe you are committed to becoming. Think about the moments in life where change actually began. It was not when everything became easy. It was not when conditions were perfect. It was when something inside you reached a point where continuing the same way became more painful than the uncertainty of change. That is where real decisions are born, not in comfort, but in contrast. When staying the same starts to cost more than becoming something new, the mind begins to open a door that was previously locked. And once that door opens, even slightly, life does not immediately transform on the outside. But internally, something irreversible has started. Because a true decision does not require immediate results, it requires finality. It removes negotiation. It removes the constant debate between what you know you should do and what you actually do. Until that decision is made, your energy is split. Part of you moves forward, and part of you stays behind, protecting the old version of yourself. This is why most people feel stuck, not because they lack ability, but because they have not committed to a single direction with enough honesty. They keep multiple versions of themselves alive at the same time. The version that wants change and the version that resists it. And every day, that internal conflict drains clarity. But the moment one decision is made fully, something powerful happens. The noise begins to reduce. The mind stops treating every option as equally valid, and suddenly direction becomes more important than doubt. One decision can redefine your life because it acts like a filter. It starts removing what does not align with it. The people who no longer match your direction begin to fall away naturally. The habits that cannot survive your new standards start to feel uncomfortable. Even the way you think about time begins to shift because now every hour is either moving you closer to that decision or pulling you away from it. There is no neutral anymore, only alignment or resistance. And what most people don't realize is that the decision itself is more important than immediate execution. Because once identity shifts, behavior eventually follows. You don't need perfect discipline at the start. You need clarity strong enough to change how you see yourself. When someone finally decides, this is no longer who I am, they begin to act differently without forcing it in the same way. It becomes less about effort and more about consistency with a new internal truth that is still unfolding, still forming, still becoming clearer with every step. Forward transformation begins when discomfort becomes unacceptable. And this is where most people quietly separate into different paths in life without even realizing it. Because discomfort exists in every life, but not everyone responds to it the same way. Some people learn to tolerate it, some people distract themselves from it, and a very small number of people allow it to become a signal that something needs to change. That difference is what defines transformation. Most people live in a zone where discomfort is familiar enough to ignore. They wake up tired, they go through routines they don't enjoy, they accept situations they don't fully agree with, and over time, that discomfort becomes normal. Not because it disappeared, but because they adapted to it. And adaptation is powerful, but it can also be dangerous when it keeps you stuck in a version of life that no longer aligns with who you could become. The human mind is designed to normalize what is repeated, even if it is not ideal. This is why transformation rarely begins with inspiration. It begins with friction, a moment where what you are experiencing internally can no longer be ignored or rationalized. It is the point where tolerance breaks. Not because the situation suddenly changed, but because your internal threshold has shifted. What once felt manageable now feels limiting. What once felt acceptable now feels heavy. And in that shift, something important happens. Awareness becomes stronger than avoidance. When discomfort becomes unacceptable, you stop negotiating with your own standards. You stop saying, "Oh, it's fine for now," when deep down you know it isn't. That internal honesty is where transformation starts to take root. Because as long as discomfort is tolerated, there is no urgency for change. And without urgency, even the best intentions remain inactive. People don't fail because they don't know what to do. They fail because they are still willing to live with the version of life they are trying to escape. There is a subtle moment in every transformation where patience turns into resistance. At first, people tolerate small misalignments. A job that doesn't fulfill them, relationships that drain them, habits that weaken them. But over time, these small tolerances accumulate. And eventually, the mind reaches a point where it can no longer justify them. That moment is not dramatic, but it is powerful. It is when inner discomfort stops being background noise and starts becoming a clear message that action is required. And yet, many people step back at this exact point. Because discomfort, even when it becomes intense, still feels safer than uncertainty. The unknown feels like a greater risk than the familiar struggle. So they return to what they know, even if it is not what they want. This is why transformation is not just about awareness. It is about willingness. Willingness to sit in uncertainty long enough to allow change to take shape. When discomfort becomes unacceptable, excuses lose their strength. The mind stops creating endless justifications for staying the same. You begin to see your current reality more clearly, not through denial, but through honesty. And that honesty can be uncomfortable in itself because it removes the illusion that things are not that bad. It forces you to acknowledge that staying where you are is also a decision, just one made repeatedly over time. This is the point where transformation starts to feel less like motivation and more like necessity. You are no longer trying to improve for the sake of ambition alone, but because remaining unchanged has become more painful than the effort required to evolve. That shift in perspective is subtle, but profound. It changes the emotional weight behind every choice you make. Now, even small decisions carry meaning because they either reinforce your current discomfort or move you away from it. And what often follows is a quiet internal rebellion, not against the world, but against your previous limits. You start questioning patterns you once accepted without thought. You begin to notice behaviors you ignored before. You become more aware of how often you compromise with yourself. And in that awareness, discomfort transforms from something passive into something active. It starts guiding you instead of suppressing you. At this stage, transformation is no longer about trying to become someone new. It is about refusing to remain the same in ways that no longer feel aligned. The discomfort does not disappear, but its role changes. It stops being something you escape from and starts becoming something you respond to. And that response is where momentum begins to build slowly, consistently, almost quietly. At first, clarity comes after commitment, not before it. And this is one of the most misunderstood ideas about change and personal growth. Most people believe they need to figure everything out first before they can commit to a direction. They wait for certainty, for perfect understanding, for a complete picture of what their future will look like. But in reality, clarity is not the starting point of transformation. It is the result of movement that begins without it. When people stay stuck, it is rarely because they lack intelligence or potential. It is because they are waiting for a level of clarity that only action can produce. They treat clarity like a prerequisite when in truth it is a byproduct. You don't think your way into a new life. You move your way into understanding it. And yet, the mind constantly tries to reverse this order. It convinces you that if you just analyze enough, plan enough, or think long enough, the right path will reveal itself fully formed. But life rarely works in complete visibility. It works in steps, in uncertainty, in partial understanding that becomes clearer only after you begin. Commitment changes the relationship you have with uncertainty. Before commitment, every option feels equally possible, equally valid, and equally confusing. The mind keeps shifting between alternatives, trying to reduce the discomfort of not knowing. But once commitment happens, something shifts internally. You stop treating every direction as open-ended. You begin to limit your focus even without having full clarity. And in that limitation, clarity starts to emerge naturally because attention is no longer scattered across possibilities. There is a difference between thinking about a path and walking on it. Thinking keeps everything theoretical. You can imagine success, failure, change, or regret without ever being affected by them directly. But commitment removes that distance. It places you inside the experience. And once you are inside the experience, feedback becomes real. You begin to notice what works and what doesn't, not in theory, but in practice. And that feedback is what gradually shapes clarity. Most people underestimate how much confusion is maintained by inaction. When you are not moving, everything feels uncertain because nothing is being tested against reality. Every idea remains abstract, every fear remains hypothetical, every possibility remains equally distant. But the moment you commit and start acting, reality begins to respond. And that response, whether positive or negative, starts refining your understanding in ways thinking alone never could. Clarity also requires exposure. You cannot gain insight into something you are not engaged with. You cannot understand discipline without practicing it. You cannot understand risk without taking it. You cannot understand yourself in motion if you only observe yourself in stillness. Commitment forces exposure, and exposure creates data. That data slowly replaces guesswork with understanding. There is also an emotional shift that comes with commitment. Before commitment, hesitation dominates. Every decision feels heavy because it carries the weight of unknown outcomes. But after commitment, hesitation begins to lose its power because your direction is already set. You are no longer deciding whether to move. You are learning how to move. That distinction changes everything. It reduces internal conflict and increases focus. Even if external uncertainty still exists, people often delay commitment because they fear being wrong. They believe that choosing a direction means closing all other doors forever. But what they don't realize is that avoiding commitment does not keep doors open. It just keeps them from entering any room fully. And without entering fully, there is no way to truly understand what lies behind any of those doors. Clarity does not come from observing all options equally. It comes from engaging deeply with one. As commitment continues, something subtle begins to happen. You start refining your choices based on experience instead of assumption. You begin to notice patterns in your behavior, your energy, your reactions. You start understanding what aligns with you and what doesn't, not because you predicted it, but because you lived it. And through that lived experience, clarity becomes sharper, more grounded, more real at the beginning. Commitment may feel like a step into uncertainty, but over time it becomes the very thing that reduces uncertainty. Because once you are fully engaged in a direction, even mistakes become informative, even failures become signals, even confusion becomes temporary instead of permanent. And gradually, what once felt like a fog starts turning into a path that becomes easier to recognize. With each step forward, your identity changes before your habits ever do. And this is where real transformation quietly begins without most people noticing it. People usually try to change their lives by forcing new behaviors. They try to wake up earlier, eat differently, work harder, stay consistent, break old patterns. But what they often miss is that behavior is not the starting point of change. It is the reflection of something deeper already shifting inside. That deeper layer is identity. Identity is the internal story you hold about who you are. It is not always spoken, but it is constantly active in the background of every decision you make. When you say, I am this kind of person, or I am not that kind of person, you are not just describing yourself, you are defining the limits of your behavior. And those limits quietly shape your actions more than motivation ever will. Because motivation changes daily, but identity stays consistent until it is challenged at its core. This is why habits alone are not enough to create lasting change. You can force a habit for a few days, even a few weeks, but if it does not align with your identity, it will eventually collapse under resistance. The mind always tries to return to what feels familiar. And what feels familiar is not what you do occasionally, but what you believe you are. That is why people often return to old patterns even after periods of progress. The behavior changed temporarily, but the identity remained the same underneath. Real transformation begins when identity starts to shift. When you no longer say, I am trying to change, but instead begin to think, I am someone who does not live that way anymore. That subtle shift changes the source of your actions. Now you are not forcing behavior to match an external goal, you are allowing behavior to align with an internal belief. And when identity leads, effort feels different. It becomes less about discipline and more about consistency with self-perception. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you believe you are becoming. Most people don't realize they are casting these votes all day long. Every time you choose comfort over growth, you reinforce one identity. Every time you choose discipline over distraction, you reinforce another. And over time, these small votes accumulate into something powerful. Not immediately visible, but deeply shaping the challenge is that identity does not change easily because it is reinforced by repetition. The mind prefers stability over disruption, even if that stability is limiting. So when you try to behave differently without changing how you see yourself, there is internal resistance. It feels unnatural, forced, temporary. But when identity begins to shift, even slightly,